diagram really illustrates the unique and yet overlapping interests and issues that researchers have with the community and stewards of place, right? So our goal is really to meet in the middle, to really kind of find and stay in that place, that sweet spot where the good stuff happens. So we have our own timelines, but community members, and we're community members too, have their own interests. And you heard them, right? That they're like, we're gonna put in 100 hours. They're not getting paid for this, right? This is stuff that they do in addition to all of their regular jobs. So our goal is to try and be cognizant of each other's kind of like limitations and try and find that sweet spot in the middle and have equitable, sustained partnerships. And we recognize that, you know, even though we're saying there's two different kind of worlds, but we're also part of this world too sometimes. Yeah, we gotta be part of that community. How do you carry yourself when you're a researcher in the community? And then Noiʻi modifies Kūlana. So it refers to seeking knowledge, to investigate, to do research. So in other words, what is your research stance? When you walk around in the community doing research, are you kind of ashamed and like you gotta hide? Or are you walking around like you feel like you can walk up to somebody and talk story with them and like, you know, have a good exchange? This has been described elsewhere in CBP research. So you might think, why is this new? This is all stuff we've learned before. But the difference is that these are things that we're applying to quantitative geoscience, environmental STEM research. So when we developed this, people were like, what the heck is this? They're not in the medical field, they don't read social science. And so we actually had, the way that we came up with these standards was to combine the best of community-based participatory research along with a lot of community meetings that we had in the Heia Ahupua. So, which is how do researchers maintain a long-term focus? How do we begin this process of community engagement and co-review? How do we begin to have knowledge stewardship, which is what most of my talk for the rest of the talk is going to be about? And how do we establish accountability? How do we crack this nut in the case of very quantitative geoscience research where people really feel like they own the data that they collect? And that begs a bigger question when we're doing this kind of research in Hawaii, which is who owns this indigenous knowledge? And in our guidance document, we take a pretty conservative for the community stance, where we believe that as part of a community's Kūlana to place, to their ancestors and to their descendants, communities have to have access to whatever data is collected there and have the ability to utilize that data. And and this is the part that's also kind of controversial. That's okay, but the part that's controversial is that they have decision-making power in determining how that data and information are shared. We develop as part of our guidance documents these guiding questions for both the community and the researchers to talk. Want to have those hard conversations at the beginning. What's the plan for developing data products? And then this one's important too, is when you as a university researcher are going into the communities, you have an obligation to let those communities know what might be the institutional clauses, policies, or agreements related to data ownership that could apply. Of course, some of this might appear to be in direct conflict with a lot of our open data policies, which is what John was talking about, open access and all of this. And so what I want to introduce you to is there's actually a global Indigenous Data Alliance who thinks about Indigenous data sovereignty. And what they do is they take what are called the FAIR principles. Many of you might be familiar with that. The data needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And to that, they have developed Indigenous data principles called CARE. You have to prove that the project will have collective benefit. The Indigenous people have to have authority to control who has responsibility, and it should be ethical. Collected and used in a way that enables Indigenous peoples to benefit from the process and also kind of benefits from inclusive development and equitable outcomes. Authority to control means that the Indigenous peoples have ability to control their data. It has to be recognized. And responsibility, that those collecting the data have the responsibility to share how that process will contribute to their benefit, including data literacy in Indigenous communities. And ethical, it must be centered on Indigenous people's well-being throughout the stages, and the benefits and harms should be evaluated from the perspective of the communities. So we developed a data and accountability agreement template,
And she developed a context and considerations, kind of like, it's basically annotated. So as you go through the agreement, it's annotated to be like, these are the considerations that you might want to be cautious about. Who does the agreement serve? What data will be collected? How will it be stored? And what happens when the project ends? And specifically, we find that in a lot of the data agreements, particularly the ones at UH, there is no mention explicitly of what if that data involves Indigenous knowledge, and who is responsible for that data, like who at UH or in the community, and then nobody is talking about who is owning this knowledge and data. And that's in quotes because many Indigenous peoples feel like knowledge can't really be owned. It can typically be unintentionally collected. You know, when you're talking story with someone, somebody tells you a story, maybe it's about la'alapa or medicine, and you've recorded it. And, you know, who does that belong to if that's a specific information about a plant that has never been, you know, really articulated before? So it can be collected unintentionally, it could be misunderstood or mistreated. And we want, the goal is for our project to be treated with the same level of respect and care. So in the section on sharing and presenting the data, we put in and really thought about language about committing to a schedule. These are things that most geoscientists are not really thinking about. And specific language on sharing data and findings before public presentations. And a statement that acknowledges the agreement to like kind of just help that from unauthorized third-party usage that might end up on publications that maybe don't include Hawaiʻi authors. So that's a reference to my last talk. And these are some examples here of things that have happened using perhaps some Indigenous knowledge. And we put in a specific section on data ownership, that it shouldn't be shared outside of the agreement without permission. It's really important to stick to the purpose of the project. And the idea there is if it goes beyond, that would trigger the need for a new agreement. And that the researchers and community have an ethical responsibility to protect that knowledge to the best of their ability. And we put it in also a section specifically on statements of institutional data ownership. Other parties, it's important to list that have ownership of the data, but might not be in agreement. These include universities, funding agencies, maybe journals, maybe the government. And everyone has to be made aware of these different parties and terms. While the Western kind of framework of ownership has really recognized the sanctity of our own bodies, they have not recognized the kinship relationships that Indigenous people have to their land and the data associated with that land and sea.